Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And this time I want to warn you before we get started that in this episode I'm going to be talking pretty frankly about what soldiers do in battle and why. And I'm even going to share a little bit of the racist language we've used in the past to label our enemies. To be clear, I don't endorse that kind of language, but I do think it's important to understand some of the ways soldiers expand that metaphorical gap between themselves and the guys they're fighting. So today is another background episode because I want to spend a few minutes on a question we've spent a lot of time and ink and pixels wondering about, especially in the last 50 years or so. What makes people willing to kill and die in war? But before we dive into that question, we need to talk about some pretty important terms. First, soldiers' job is to kill the enemy. They don't neutralize, they don't delete, they don't service the target, they don't, my personal least favorite euphemism for killing, they don't unalive the enemy. They kill. Yes, get them drunk and comfortable, and you might hear veterans talk about waxing somebody, or smoking them, or fucking them up, or taking them down, or any number of other euphemisms that distance them from the act. But when we talk about what soldiers do, it's disingenuous to pretend it's something it's not. And second, what soldiers do is not murder. As long as they're acting within the limits of their mission, as long as they're killing other soldiers who would kill them if they had the chance, it's not what most law codes or religious traditions would consider murder. Homicide, yes, it's a person killing another person, but not murder. I feel like I have to say this because I've noticed a popular trend to say so-and-so murdered his enemies, even if it was in the context of war. But murder is a specific and grievous crime, and it's not fair to apply that term to a soldier doing his duty. Killing an unarmed civilian or an enemy soldier who has surrendered, that's murder. But sticking a spear into somebody who's trying to stick a spear into you, not murder, no matter how much the technology changes. So back to our question. What makes people willing to kill and die in war? There are plenty of theories on this, but it's really two distinct questions. Number one, why do people go to war in the first place? And number two, why do they stay when the shooting starts? And when I talk about people going to war and staying at war, I'm not talking about the politicians who are making the decision someplace nice and safe an ocean away. I'm talking about the guys on the ground. Why are they there? Why do they stay there? In my experience around soldiers, these are separate questions with separate answers. And we need to consider both of them because wars don't happen unless the participants answer both questions for themselves. If you've been to war, or you've seen a war movie, or you've read a book about war, you've seen or heard about the difference between people who've answered the call to war and people who have actually been under fire. Fresh-faced young boys become grizzled veterans in the space of weeks or even days on the front lines. And these are the kinds of descriptions authors use, at least in the English-speaking world. But why do the fresh-faced young boys go to war in the first place? You could ask 100 veterans and get 100 answers, but I think they'd all fall into three general categories. Number one, it seemed like the right thing to do. Number two, they made me. Number three, I'm going to be a hero or rich or famous. As to why they stay to become grizzled veterans, you got three very similar categories there too. Number one, I can't leave my friends. Number two, I can't get home unless I do what they tell me. Number three, I like this life. So let's take a few minutes to look at these categories. Then we'll look into how to make people kill each other. Why do people go to war? That answer is going to be different depending on the culture we're studying. A middle-class young American today will probably tell you it's about defending our country, or protecting his family, or maybe preserving our way of life. A Red Army conscript in 1942 would have been drafted into service and thrown into the front lines with very little training, especially by our standards, and pretty much no way to say no. And a Danish teen gone a Viking in the 9th century would be in it for glory and loot. And we'll look at all three if you stick with me long enough. But let's dive into each one of our three categories a little more deeply. Number one, it seemed like the right thing to do. This is the answer you get if you talk to most volunteer soldiers of the 19th and 20th centuries and today. We go to war today because our country calls, because we're convinced fighting in a war on the other side of the world is somehow essential to our country's prosperity, or to our family's security, or to the improved well-being of the world community. Or it's a point of honor to answer our country's call to service no matter where it leads, because somebody has to, and too many people aren't willing to these days. These are the soldiers we talk about when we talk about duty, honor, country, which, if you didn't know it, is West Point's motto. These are the noble warriors our culture makes a point of admiring, because they didn't have to go, and they went anyway. Sometimes these feelings are true and appropriate. Sometimes the danger is real, and we have to stand up and face it with weapons in our hands. In our recent history, World War II certainly falls into this category. The Cold War II probably represented a real threat, and we certainly had to respond to the 9/11 attack. But there's a danger to this sort of motivation, because this is exactly how demagogues and propagandists want us to feel. After all, if fascism was a threat to the American way of life, communism must also be a threat. And if communism was a threat, certainly terrorism is. And if you can convince enough people that the threat is out there and they can stop it if they just do what you say, well, you might look up one day and realize nothing has really changed for all the blood you've shed, except that a few people have become wealthy and powerful by stoking the fear that inspired you to go to war in the first place. The next reason is a little simpler. They made me. If you could do a survey of soldiers across the ages, I think the majority of them would fall into this category. These are the conscripts, the draftees, sometimes the slaves who go to war because the law says they have to, or because their families live at the pleasure of their feudal lords, or because they find their masters more frightening than the weapons of the enemy. We don't think much of sending conscripts to war these days, at least in the U.S. and most of our Western allies. But we've done it in the past, and we would again if the threat was great enough. More authoritarian societies like Russia and North Korea and China employ conscripts extensively. Compulsory service is one of the reasons regimes like these can field some of the largest standing military forces the world has ever seen. And regimes of the past sent slaves into battle very effectively. The Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire were slaves trained to battle from an early age, and showered with honors and privileges, and bound to fight the Sultan's wars whenever he called them. The third reason has quite a bit of overlap with the first, and some with the second, but I include it as its own category because it has historically been a reason all its own. I'm going to be a hero, or rich, or famous. We downplay this one these days, but it's been big in the past. If you could ask modern soldiers and get them to answer honestly, I think many of them would mention a desire to be a hero, or maybe to prove themselves as at least part of their motivation. And while the GI Bill doesn't constitute riches on its own, the promise of a college education and the increased income it's supposed to make possible for someone who otherwise could never afford one is a powerful motivator. And it's been an even more important motivator in the past. It's really only been 100 years or so since the idea of winning glory stopped being a recruiting tool. Even as late as the Spanish-American War in 1898, Theodore Roosevelt explicitly went to war to make a name for himself. Hell, it wasn't uncommon for young men going into politics to go to war in order to add some legitimacy to their future campaigns. It happened in the Roman Republic, and it also happened in Vietnam. Soldiering for money also has a long history. Greek hoplites who enjoyed fighting outsiders only a little more than they enjoyed fighting other Greeks often hired out as mercenaries across the Mediterranean and Near East. The city-state of Carthage, Rome's nemesis in the 3rd century BCE, didn't trust standing armies, instead preferring to employ mercenaries from elsewhere in Africa, and often even Greek hoplites. Switzerland made an industry out of supplying mercenaries to many European powers in the 14th century CE. Swiss mercenaries were so highly regarded that they were hired on as the personal guard of the Pope himself, a tradition that continues today with the Swiss guards at the Vatican. And as recently as the American campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, private security companies, mercenaries by another name, like Blackwater, took on jobs that might otherwise have been done by American service members. It makes a certain amount of sense when you think about it. If you need soldiers, you need them to be reliable. Soldiers who are there out of duty or patriotism might turn against you if they don't see the point of your campaign, or if they start to feel like you're not patriotic enough to justify their sacrifice. Soldiers looking for glory or fame might balk at defending against a months-long siege or sticking to a campaign that's going poorly. But soldiers who are in it for the money, assuming they have some regard for their own personal integrity, are going to remain on your side as long as you keep paying them. Maybe longer if you can convincingly promise them that you can deliver riches at some definable point in the future. So those are the main reasons people go to war. But signing up to fight is a whole different animal from actually sticking with it when bullets are flying or steel is clashing and lives are ending around you. Why do people stick with it after the fighting starts? Again, I think there are 3 primary reasons. Number 1, I can't leave my friends. It was a common refrain when I was in the Army. We all joined up for our own reasons, but when the shooting starts, we're fighting for the guys to our left and right. And there's a lot of truth to that. When you've known somebody for months or years, trained with them until each of you knows how the others think, done things together that you would have sworn were impossible before you did them, you develop a bond even stronger in some ways than the ties of family. There's a reason soldiers call each other brothers and sisters. And when shit gets ugly, you're there for them because you know they're there for you. That's not to say people don't still desert. Of course they do. And many militaries even today would rather cultivate fear of their leaders in soldiers than love for their fellows. But where this dynamic exists and where it's encouraged by leadership, it's a powerful force to keep guys in the fight, even when the fight doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Number 2, I can't get home unless I do what they tell me. The soldier far from home doesn't have that many options away from his unit. He may not speak the language, and even if he does, he probably doesn't know local customs. He doesn't look or act like the people around him. He won't be able to blend in with the locals, and even if he finds a sympathetic host willing to shelter him from the people who will definitely come looking for him, his chances of getting away undetected are slim. If he's in so-called enemy territory, or if the enemy takes over the territory where he's trying to hide, his difficulties are even greater. And in most cases, it's usually better to be found by your own side than captured by the enemy. Even when that's not true, a soldier's leaders will try to make him believe it in order to encourage just this sort of motivation. And even if none of these things is true, there's the financial obstacle. Eventually, if you survive, the military will send you home. If you desert, you have to pay your own way home, or you have to stay where you are. Very few young people are willing to turn away from their homes and families and start a new life from scratch in a new place. It's a lot less scary to stick it out in the hope that you'll make it through and go home eventually. Reason number 3. I like this life. Even today, this is true of a lot of soldiers. Some enjoy the feeling of power that comes from carrying a weapon around people who are mostly unarmed. Some like feeling like they're doing something important, something most of the people back home weren't willing to do. Some even like the feeling of power they get from killing the enemy or from surviving a firefight. Or they like the combination of simplicity and importance. When you're at war, few things matter other than honor and survival. Most of the time, you have a pretty good idea where your next meal is going to come from and when you'll get it. You don't have to worry about rent or what to wear or impressing the neighbors. You don't even have to worry about whether your wife and kids are happy because you've done all you can for them from where you are. And if going to war cost you your marriage, well, that means you survived to go home and get divorced. You can worry about that later, after you survive. There's an odd freedom in knowing the only thing you really have to worry about is whether you and your soldiers make it to tomorrow. It's a freedom so profound that many soldiers these days have trouble readjusting to what most of us consider normal life. Because once you've played for life and death stakes, it's hard to accept that any stakes short of that matter at all. So those are some general principles to describe why people go to war and why they stay to fight even at the risk of death. But what about the killing itself? It's a common characterization in modern media. We admire the noble hero, the one who does his duty even though he despises the violence. It's so common as to be almost a cliche, and the hero gets bonus points because not only does he hate killing, not only does he have a well-buffered heart of gold, he's really, really good at kicking ass. Well, that guy has his roots in the truth. But it's hard to say whether the archetype is based more on real people or whether we have encouraged our soldiers to act like the archetype for the last century or so. Certainly it's the persona most American military heroes have presented to the public since about World War II. But most service members, even in our military, don't live up to the archetype. For one, in my experience, guys who are good at violence kind of enjoy it. Maybe they enjoy the rush of adrenaline or the feeling of power rather than the killing itself. But that's a little like the guy who says he likes to feel pleasantly lubricated but doesn't like drinking alcohol or smoking weed. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. You're allowed to like alcohol and even weed in most states, but tell people you like killing and you'll find your table empty pretty quick. It hasn't always been like that. A Spartan hoplite or a Celtic hero or a Norseman gone a Viking or a French crusader knight or a Mongol riding for Genghis Khan might be in the opposite position of our modern archetype. Any of those guys who dared to say they didn't like killing would have found themselves immediately ostracized by their fellows, no matter how good at it they were. Hell, even an upper-class Englishman living in the late 19th century might have been expected to tell stories where the thrill of battle against African tribesmen or Indian mutineers or wild Chinese hordes figured prominently. Such stories would only have been appropriate for male audiences, of course. These days you can only get away with stories like that if you're drunk. And the story wouldn't be about your own exploits, but about the bravery of the guys who didn't make it back, and maybe about how lucky you were to escape whatever got them. My point is, our attitudes about violence, about the appropriateness of violence, change over time and between cultures. And those attitudes have a huge impact on how soldiers experience violence. Not to mention that many soldiers in history had the opposite attitude. They couldn't bring themselves to kill, even when the enemy was right in front of them. You may have heard stories of soldiers in the American Civil War going through the motions of loading and aiming, but never actually firing. Some rifles were found after early battles with 7 or 8 rounds in the barrel, all properly rammed in on top of each other, but never fired. Or soldiers and Marines in Vietnam firing without aiming, just sticking their rifles up over the cover without looking to see where they were shooting. I think you could probably find similar examples from any war you cared to look at. The archer who somehow always comes back with a full quiver, or gives his arrows to his fellows when they run low. The warrior who's perfectly willing to push the shield wall, but somehow never finds a gap to thrust his sword through. The pikeman whose thrusts somehow always slip between his enemies. I think the guys who like killing and the guys who can't kill probably make up the minority of most historical armies. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. We can kill if we need to, but we'll be perfectly happy if we can come home from the war without ever having done so. So how does a war leader maximize the chances that his soldiers will be willing to kill when he needs them to? Well, I'm glad you asked. In my amateur studies of people and war, I've come up with a rule that seems to hold true in most scenarios. The further you can separate the soldier from his enemy, the more likely he is to kill. Now, the word separate is doing a lot of work in that sentence, so let's break it down. The separation we're talking about here can be physical or metaphorical or both. Physical separation is easy to visualize. The closer you are to your enemy, the more you have to share his agony and terror as he dies, the more trouble you'll have killing him. You're more likely to stick him with a sword if his back is turned than if you have to look him in the eye. You're more likely to stick him with a spear or a pike than with a sword or a dagger. You're more likely to shoot him with an arrow or a sling than to stick him with a spear. You're more likely to fire a musket or a rifle at a group than at a single man. You're more likely still to fire a cannon as part of a crew, especially if you can't see where your rounds are hitting. You're more likely to drop a bomb on a vehicle or fire a missile at an aircraft than to do either at a group of men in the open. And you're more likely to push a button to launch a missile than any of these. Strangely, modern technology turns this on its head a little bit. A sniper with a good scope can see a man's face more clearly from 1,000 meters than a rifleman with iron sights from 200 meters. The gunner in an armored vehicle or helicopter equipped with thermal sights can see his targets better than he could in broad daylight, even from a mile away, even if they're behind cover. He can see them come apart from the impact of his 20 or 30 millimeter machine gun rounds. Watch them twitch and flail around on the ground as they die. Watch the survivors scramble for cover that won't protect them any better than a car door would protect you from a .30-06 rifle round. The guys who do work like that have to be trained to it, desensitized somewhat, and more important, they have to be convinced that what they're doing is the right thing. Which brings us to metaphorical separation. One way to do this is to dehumanize your enemy. The less like you he is, the easier it is to kill him. This is pretty easy when societies are small and tribal. Anybody who's not part of your tribe is an other, with different customs, different language, different way of looking at the world. They might look different, worship different gods, wear different clothes or adornments or body markings. Their hair or skin might be a different color than yours. It's easy for the brain to spin differences that, let's face it, we consider pretty minor these days into unbridgeable gaps. Especially when the people around us are doing the same thing. Especially if you have a charismatic leader, maybe a holy figure, emphasizing the differences and telling you how alien those people are. Telling you how much less they are than you. How far below you on the scale of humanity, barely above the animals you herd and slaughter and eat, telling you how, just like animals, it's okay to kill them. And you give them different names. They're not people, they're the enemy. That guy you caught in that open field isn't a soldier, he's a target, or even a bad guy. And the names we use to describe the enemy often exaggerate their cultural or racial differences. We didn't fight Germans and Japanese in the Second World War. We fought Krauts and Jerrys and Japs. In Korea and Vietnam, they were Gooks and Chi-Coms. In Iraq and Afghanistan, they were Hajis. Maybe a little less racist than Gooks because Haji is actually a term of respect among Muslims, but we certainly didn't mean it as a compliment. And while leaders may not strictly encourage the use of this kind of racist language, they don't do much to quash it either. The other way to create separation, as we've already touched on, is through training and conditioning. Uniforms and the customs and ceremonies of military life serve this purpose. As travel and communication become easier, as our world shrinks, it gets harder to convince ourselves that those guys over there are less human than these guys over here. So you make the distinctions between us and them sharper by training young men to take pride in their uniforms, to perform their ceremonies perfectly, to maintain their equipment in exactly the right way, to communicate the way they're supposed to. You teach them to be proud of their unit, their branch of service, and their country. Then it's easy to spot the others. They're the ones who don't take the same pride in their appearance, who carry different equipment, whose rank insignia look different. And what's with the funny way they're marching? They're so different, I bet even scrawny little Schmedlap, the guy nobody in the unit respects, could probably take a couple of them. And you don't shrink from using the word kill. The more comfortable soldiers are with the word, the thinking goes, the more comfortable they can become with the act. You make sure they understand the difference between killing in battle and murder. One is an unpleasant duty that we do on behalf of our country, while the other is frowned upon by God and man. You can find man's forgiveness killing the enemy, but only God can forgive you for murder. And the killing we do in battle is emphatically not murder. So that's how we do it. And it's not all that different from how we've always done it. It's why young people, and especially young men, are the ideal candidates for soldiers. Not only are they at the peak of their physical strength and fitness, but they can be guided and shaped and molded in ways that don't work as well on older, more mature minds. Higher levels of testosterone make them naturally more aggressive. It's not so difficult to direct that aggression, train them to harness and use it, to convince them they're powerful and indestructible and more than a match for anybody they might face across a battlefield. Then you give them the best armor and weapons you can afford, because in addition to all that separation, we're more likely to kill if we feel less vulnerable to being killed ourselves. Of course, all this talk about killing ignores a critical factor, one we're just learning to deal with as a society and mostly doing a pretty piss-poor job of, although better than we did 50 years ago. And that's addressing and dealing with the psychological cost of killing to the soldiers who have to do it. I'm talking about long-term trauma, about what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder and its associated issues. That's not something I'm equipped to discuss right now, and it'll take an entire episode all on its own when and if I ever am. Probably a long one, but I'm not ignoring it, and I'll explore it and its effects when we run into situations where it seems appropriate to discuss. So that's it for this episode. If I haven't driven you off with my talk about killing, I hope we'll see you next time. Till then, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.